In a bustling upscale restaurant in the heart of Los Angeles, where the glitz and glamour of the city's elite come alive, the atmosphere is filled with the buzz of luxury. The restaurant, renowned for its exclusive clientele, has long been a favorite spot for those who enjoy fine dining and indulging in opulence. The walls shimmer with a subtle gold sheen, the table settings are immaculate, and every detail is carefully curated to make the guests feel as though they've entered a world of privilege. It's a place where the prices are as high as the expectations, and the rich are treated like royalty. Reservations are made months in advance, and the slightest misstep in manners or decorum is often met with disapproval. For most, the experience is more than just a meal, it's a chance to flaunt wealth and status, a place where one's value is often judged by the brand of their clothes, the car they drive, and the watch they wear. Yet, amidst this air of exclusivity, one man walks in who doesn't fit the mold. He's dressed simply, without the shiny luxury brands that the restaurant's usual patrons wear. His jeans are worn, his shirt unadorned, and his hair messy, giving him the appearance of just another ordinary person walking through the doors. To the regulars, he is nothing more than a contrast to the elegance that fills the room. But little do they know, this man is Keanu Reeves, one of Hollywood's most respected actors, loved not just for his talent but for his humble and kind-hearted nature. As he walks into the restaurant, the attention he attracts is not because of his wealth or status, but because of his unassuming demeanor. No one knows who he is yet, and that's just how Keanu likes it. He's not here to impress anyone with material wealth or flamboyant displays of luxury. The irony is, however, that while the restaurant is a place built around the pursuit of image and status, it's this simplicity that makes Keanu stand out the most, completely unaware of the judgmental eyes that are starting to scrutinize him. What was supposed to be a quiet, uneventful evening for him was about to turn into a powerful lesson about the importance of respect, kindness, and the human connection that transcends appearances. Keanu Reeves walked into the upscale restaurant with the same calm demeanor that has become his trademark over the years. To the casual observer, he looked like any other regular person, dressed simply in a plain black t-shirt, well-worn jeans, and comfortable shoes, nothing flashy, no designer labels, and certainly no expensive accessories. His hair was slightly tousled, and a few days' worth of scruff dotted his face. In the midst of a high-end dining room where the wealthiest of Los Angeles's elite were gathered, he stood out not because of his extravagance but because of his simplicity. He was a man who chose comfort over couture, humility over arrogance, and kindness over the pretension that so often accompanies affluence. But to Ashley, the young waitress working that night, Keanu was just another customer. She had no idea who he was, and quite frankly, that didn't matter to her. She had learned early on that appearances mattered in this business. The finer restaurants in Beverly Hills were all about status, about being seen, about projecting wealth and power in every corner of the room. The way a person dressed, the car they drove, and the way they carried themselves were all signals to the staff about how to treat them. For Ashley, who had spent years working at the Lumiere, this was second nature. She prided herself on knowing who deserved the best service and who didn't. When she first saw Keanu, she couldn't help but wrinkle her nose. This man, dressed so plainly, was certainly not what she would consider worthy of the attention given to the wealthier patrons. She quickly put on a professional smile and approached him with a level of indifference, trying to mask her judgment. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" she asked, her tone laced with impatience, as if she already expected the answer to be no. Her eyes scanned him up and down, assessing him like she did with every customer. But he wasn't like the others. He didn't seem to care that his appearance didn't match the restaurant's high standards. Instead of getting flustered or defensive, he simply smiled back, his eyes calm and warm, and responded that he didn't have a reservation but hoped there was still a table available. Ashley, despite her internal criticism, led him to a quiet, inconspicuous table tucked away in the back corner of the restaurant, near the kitchen. It was the kind of spot she reserved for those she deemed less deserving of the prime seating areas. "This will be perfect for you, sir," she said with forced politeness, sliding the menu in front of him. Just a heads up, the prices are listed next to each dish, so there won't be any surprises. She let the sarcasm hang in the air, expecting him to squirm, to feel out of place. But Keanu, unfazed by her subtle digs, remained composed. His demeanor was almost peaceful, as if he had entered the restaurant for nothing more than a simple meal and was unaffected by the judgment that was already being placed upon him. As he scanned the menu, Ashley couldn't help but feel a growing irritation. He seemed entirely oblivious to the weight of the environment he was in, no concern about fitting in, no apparent need to impress anyone around him. That made her uncomfortable, but it also made her curious. She watched him for a moment longer, his calmness somehow defying the tension that seemed to fill the room. Yet, at that moment, she still believed he was just another person who didn't belong here. She was about to learn, however, that Keanu Reeves was not just another customer, and this night would become a lesson she would never forget. As the evening wore on, Sophie continued her interactions with Keanu Reeves, each time returning to his table with the same air of condescension. Despite his quiet and unassuming nature, Sophie couldn't help but feel a growing sense of superiority, especially as she observed the other guests in the restaurant. To her, this was a world where status, wealth, and appearance were the only things that mattered, and Keanu's unpretentious demeanor only seemed to highlight how out of place he was. As she walked past the tables of well-dressed, high-profile individuals, it was as if the entire room was buzzing with an unspoken judgment, a judgment that Keanu, completely unaware of his celebrity, didn't seem to care about. It was that very indifference that irked Sophie the most. She had grown accustomed to people trying to impress or at least acknowledge the grandeur of the restaurant, but here was a man who seemed unbothered by it all, almost as if he was above it. When Sophie returned to take his order, she couldn't suppress the sarcasm that dripped from her words. "Have you decided what you'd like to order?" she asked, her tone sharp and calculated. Keanu looked up from the menu, his eyes still calm, as he lightly smiled and placed his order. "I'll have the filet mignon with truffle sauce, and a glass of red wine to go with it. Can you recommend something?" His request was simple but exacting, the kind of meal anyone with money to burn might order. Sophie's mind instantly went to her usual recommendation for the high-end customers, the Chateau Margaux, a wine she knew to be one of the priciest on the list. But she couldn't resist the opportunity to undercut him, to make him feel the weight of the lavish environment he was in. Her voice carried a slight sneer as she said, "Our sommelier usually recommends the Chateau Margaux. It's an exceptional wine, but rather expensive," she emphasized the last word, almost daring him to back out. Sophie expected him to hesitate, perhaps apologize for not knowing what he was ordering, or even back down from the expensive wine. But Keanu's response surprised her. He smiled gently and nodded, unfazed. "That sounds great. I trust your recommendation." His calm demeanor in the face of her passive aggression made her feel almost foolish, and yet, she pushed on, further testing him. When Keanu's food finally arrived, Sophie made a point to slam the plate onto the table, her actions deliberate, meant to show her frustration. "Here's your filet mignon, I hope it meets your expectations," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, as if she were daring him to complain. But Keanu didn't flinch. He simply smiled, thanked her, and began to eat, his posture as relaxed as ever. It seemed like nothing could touch him. As she stood there, watching him savor his meal, Sophie couldn't help but feel a growing sense of discomfort. It wasn't just the fact that he didn't seem affected by her attitude, but that he was so genuine in his calmness, as if he had no need to prove anything to anyone. In a world obsessed with status and image, Keanu's quiet confidence felt like a challenge to everything Sophie had come to believe. As the night went on, Sophie continued her rounds, but she kept finding herself returning to Keanu's table, unable to shake the feeling that something was different about him. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, but in his silence, he was commanding more respect than any designer-clad customer she had ever encountered. It was unsettling. Sophie had always assumed that the people who were treated the best in places like this were those who had the wealth and the outward appearance to match, but Keanu seemed to defy that logic. There was something deeper at play here, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. In her mind, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, he knew something she didn't. What was it about him that made him so immune to her barbs, so unshakable in the face of judgment? It was a question that lingered in her mind, and as the night wore on, the unease grew. But at that moment, she had no idea that she was about to learn a lesson that would turn her world upside down and force her to reevaluate everything she thought she knew about people, respect, and what it really means to have class. As the night continued, the interactions between Keanu and Sophie became the silent drama unfolding in the background of the high-end restaurant. Sophie, ever so sure of herself, couldn't understand what made Keanu tick. Despite her best efforts to undermine him with her condescending remarks, he remained calm, collected, and almost impossibly gracious. To her, it was like he wasn't even bothered by the undercurrent of judgment swirling around him. As she walked past his table, she couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of frustration and curiosity. How could someone, especially someone she had so wrongly pegged as unimportant, remain so unaffected by everything around them? It was almost as if he had seen through the superficiality that surrounded them both. When she returned with his dessert, the unease that had been simmering under the surface finally reached its peak. Keanu had ordered a chocolate cake with cherry liquor filling, and Sophie, determined to make him feel the sting of his own foolishness, couldn't resist another opportunity for passive-aggressive commentary. "Are you sure you want dessert?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe you'd be better off saving your money for the wine you already ordered." Sophie thought her words would hit home, that they would make him question himself, but instead, Keanu just chuckled softly, his eyes warm and unaffected. "I'm sure," Keanu replied, his tone light and matter-of-fact. "Sometimes dessert is the best part of the meal." His answer disarmed her completely, and for the first time that evening, she couldn't hide the bewilderment creeping onto her face. Here was a man, dressed in nothing but a simple t-shirt and jeans, clearly out of place in a world that placed so much value on superficial appearances, and yet, he exuded an aura of confidence and grace that Sophie couldn't quite wrap her head around. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, wasn't trying to fit in or live up to expectations. He was just being himself. And that was more than enough for him. As the night wore on, Sophie's internal conflict deepened. She had spent years in the restaurant industry, learning how to spot who was worthy of respect based on their appearance and social status. The high rollers who came into places like this were the ones who deserved her attention, the ones who needed to feel like they were the center of the world. And yet, Keanu, this unassuming man who didn't even seem to care about the pomp and circumstance of the place, was drawing more attention, more respect, than any of the others. There was a quiet dignity in his behavior, something that made the others in the restaurant start to take notice. The whispers among the tables became louder, not about his wealth or his fame, but about how different he was from the typical patrons who dined there. For the first time, the judgmental glances Sophie had grown so used to giving didn't seem to matter to Keanu. He wasn't bothered by them. He didn't care about how much money people had, or how they looked, or what they drove. But Sophie was still caught up in her own world of judgments, of appearances, and her inability to let go of these beliefs only seemed to intensify her frustration. She had no idea who this man was, but she continued to treat him as if he didn't belong, as if he was some kind of lesser customer who had stumbled into a place he didn't deserve to be. As she walked to the back of the restaurant, the murmurs among the guests only grew louder. She could hear the whispers about the odd man in the corner, the one who didn't care about the rules, the one who didn't even try to fit in. There was a palpable sense of intrigue that seemed to radiate from the other patrons, a quiet admiration for his unwavering composure in the face of the unspoken rules of the restaurant. What Sophie didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that everything was about to change in an instant. The elderly man in the blue suit, who had been quietly watching the scene unfold all evening, finally made his move. He stood up from his seat, his movements slow but deliberate, and made his way over to the manager of the restaurant. Sophie watched with confusion as the manager's face changed from one of casual indifference to one of shock. Before she could react, the manager was rushing toward Keanu's table, his eyes wide with recognition. Sophie's heart skipped a beat, and she could feel the sweat gathering on the back of her neck. What was happening? Why was the manager so suddenly concerned? And then, in that moment, everything clicked. The manager leaned in towards Keanu, his voice full of enthusiasm as he spoke in hushed tones. "Mr. Reeves, it's such an honor to have you here tonight. We didn't know you would be joining us. We would have prepared something special for you." Sophie froze in her tracks, her eyes wide with disbelief. Keanu Reeves, the same man she had been treating with such dismissive condescension, was none other than the famous actor, the one everyone in the restaurant had been gossiping about in whispers. Sophie's heart sank, and she felt a sharp pang of guilt rush over her. It was as if the entire world had suddenly flipped upside down, and she realized just how wrong she had been. The man she had so carelessly judged, the man she had assumed didn't belong, was Keanu Reeves. In that moment, Sophie understood that she had made a grave mistake, not just in her treatment of him, but in her entire worldview. It wasn't about who had money, who had the right clothes, or who belonged in certain spaces. It was about respect, about kindness, about being human. And Sophie, in her arrogance, had failed to see that. What happened next would be a lesson she would never forget, one that would forever change the way she saw not only Keanu but also herself. The moment the manager called out Keanu's name, the air in the restaurant shifted. Sophie stood frozen in place, her heart racing as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The whispers, the stares, the awkwardness, all of it came crashing down on her in an instant. The man she had treated with such disdain, the man she had judged so quickly and harshly, was Keanu Reeves. The world around her seemed to slow as she realized her grave mistake. In that split second, Sophie felt the weight of her actions, the consequences of her assumptions, and the depth of her own ignorance. How had she allowed herself to slip into such shallow thinking, to treat someone with less respect simply because they didn't look the part? Keanu, on the other hand, remained calm. His demeanor hadn't changed at all. He wasn't angry, he wasn't upset, and he wasn't demanding special treatment. He simply smiled politely at the manager, accepting the apology and offering words of kindness in return. His voice was calm, almost serene, as he explained that he was there just to enjoy a quiet meal, to experience the simple pleasure of good food and company, not to be treated any differently because of who he was or what people thought of him. He didn't need a grand gesture. He didn't need the spotlight. He didn't want the attention. All he wanted was a meal, like anyone else. And that simple desire spoke volumes about his character. As the realization hit Sophie, the guilt that washed over her was almost unbearable. She had failed to see the humanity in Keanu Reeves, the same humanity she had prided herself on seeing in others. For years, Sophie had worked in the restaurant industry, a place that so often revolved around judgment, status, and image. She had become accustomed to categorizing people based on their appearance, their clothing, their car, their ability to drop large sums of money. She had convinced herself that these outward markers were the only things that mattered in this world. She had judged, time and again, without ever questioning why she did it or how it made others feel. But Keanu, in his quiet humility, had shown her the flaw in her thinking. His grace, his ease in the face of her cold treatment, had been a mirror to her own insecurities. As she stood there, trying to process what had just happened, she realized that she had been living in a world where appearances meant everything, but where kindness and respect meant very little. Keanu had not played by the same rules. He didn't wear the wealth and status of others as a badge. Instead, he wore his humility like a crown, refusing to be measured by anything other than his own integrity and his treatment of others. Sophie had judged him because she believed that his simple appearance meant he didn't deserve the same level of respect as the other, more ostentatious customers. But she had been wrong. She had missed the very thing that Keanu had been trying to teach all along: true respect doesn't come from the things we own or the clothes we wear. It comes from how we treat others, how we value their humanity, regardless of their social status. As the manager hurried off, now visibly flustered with apologies and gratitude, Sophie stood still, trying to reconcile the overwhelming sense of shame that had settled in her chest. The entire room seemed to be watching her, their gazes piercing through her, silently judging the judgment she had passed earlier. The realization was too much for her to handle in that moment. Her own self-perception shattered as she saw the difference between how she had treated Keanu and how he had treated everyone around him, so full of grace, so free from the judgments she had carried for years. But then, as if to prove the point even further, Keanu looked up at Sophie, his expression soft but sincere. "It's okay," he said quietly, his voice carrying no resentment, no anger, just simple understanding. "We all make mistakes. It's what we do afterward that matters." His words, simple yet profound, struck Sophie to her core. She had made a mistake, yes, but this was not the end of the world. What mattered was how she learned from it, how she grew from this experience. She had been given a rare opportunity, a chance to see beyond her own prejudices, to step outside of her own narrow view of the world, and to choose a different path. Sophie's face flushed as she heard the words, and for the first time that evening, she realized that the power to change lay within her, not in the world around her. The way she treated people, the way she judged them, those things were within her control. And Keanu, with all his quiet strength, had just shown her the way forward. It wasn't about becoming wealthy, fashionable, or popular. It wasn't about fitting into some preconceived mold of who she thought she should be. It was about being kind, about respecting others, about understanding that every person who walked through those doors had a story, a history, a life that couldn't be understood by the way they dressed or the car they drove. As the night wore on, Sophie couldn't help but reflect on her behavior and her mindset. She thought about her future in the restaurant industry, and whether she could ever look at people the same way again. She had been given a profound lesson, and she knew that her next step was to change, to be more mindful, more understanding, more open to seeing people for who they truly were, not just for the image they projected. Keanu left the restaurant that night, quietly slipping into the night as he always did, his humility leaving a lasting impression on everyone present. For Sophie, that evening would mark the beginning of a transformation. She would never again look at a person and judge them based on their appearance or their wealth. She would remember Keanu's lesson: respect for others, regardless of who they were or where they came from, was the true measure of a person's worth. The next morning, as the golden light of dawn spilled over the streets of Los Angeles, Sophie woke up with a sense of quiet determination. The events of the previous night had left a deep imprint on her heart, one that she could no longer ignore. The weight of her actions, the way she had treated Keanu Reeves, had haunted her all night. She replayed the moments over and over in her mind, the smug tone in her voice, the dismissive gestures, the way she had looked at him with judgment, all because he didn't fit the image she thought belonged in a place like Lumiere. But more than that, what weighed heavily on her was the lesson Keanu had unknowingly given her, a lesson that cut through her well-built walls of cynicism and arrogance. It was a lesson about kindness, humility, and respect, one that she could no longer pretend to overlook. Sophie had spent so much of her life in the restaurant business, where appearances were everything, and status was the measuring stick by which everyone was judged. She had always told herself that her job required her to discern who was worthy of the best service, who would tip well, who would order the expensive bottle of wine. Over the years, she had cultivated a sharp sense of who belonged in the world of luxury and who didn't. But that thinking, that mentality, was broken in an instant by Keanu's calm presence and effortless humility. He hadn't asked for special treatment. He hadn't flaunted anything. In fact, he had done the opposite. He had remained grounded, unpretentious, and kind. And that kindness had been a mirror to her own actions, showing her just how far she had strayed from what truly mattered. As Sophie prepared for another day at work, she knew she couldn't go back to the same mindset. She couldn't go back to judging people based on their clothes, their wealth, or their outward appearance. Something inside her had shifted, and she understood, deep down, that she needed to do better. She needed to embody the respect and humility that Keanu had shown her, not just to him, but to everyone she interacted with. The thought of returning to Lumiere, knowing the lesson she had learned, made her anxious, but also hopeful. She was ready to face the consequences of her actions, but more importantly, she was ready to change. When Sophie arrived at work, she could feel the tension in the air. Her colleagues buzzed with their usual chatter about the night before, but there was an undercurrent of judgment, especially when it came to her. She could sense their eyes on her as she walked past them to the back of the restaurant. They had all witnessed her behavior, her arrogance toward Keanu, and now they were waiting for her to acknowledge it. Sophie knew this was her moment to step up, to own her mistake and to show them that she was capable of change. The silence in the kitchen was palpable as she entered. She could feel the weight of the eyes that followed her, but this time, it wasn't judgment she felt, it was a challenge. She could feel the eyes of her peers silently asking if she would do what she needed to do, if she would apologize, and if she would be the person they hoped she could become. Taking a deep breath, Sophie gathered the courage to speak. "I owe all of you an apology," she said, her voice steady but laced with sincerity. "Last night, I made a huge mistake. I treated a guest with disrespect because of the way he looked. I judged him, and I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. That man was Keanu Reeves. But the truth is, it doesn't matter who he is. What matters is that I should have treated him with the same respect I would treat anyone else. And I didn't. I'm sorry for that." The room fell silent as Sophie's words hung in the air. Her colleagues exchanged glances, but they didn't interrupt. The apology wasn't just for Keanu, it was for herself, for the person she had become in her quest for status and recognition. It was a moment of vulnerability, a moment where she acknowledged that her actions had fallen short of the standard she wanted to uphold. Sophie had always prided herself on being confident, but in that moment, she realized that true strength came from humility. The manager, Richard, who had witnessed the interaction with Keanu, was the first to speak. "Sophie," he said softly, "what you did last night wasn't easy for anyone to watch. But owning up to it the way you just did, that's the first step. The second step is to remember the lesson we all saw: it's not about who someone is on the outside. It's about how we treat them, how we make them feel." Keanu didn't need to prove himself to anyone. He just treated everyone with kindness and respect, and that's what we should all strive for. Sophie nodded, her throat tight as she felt the weight of his words settle into her chest. It wasn't just about her apology, it was about the change she was committing to. She wanted to be better, not just in her job, but as a person. She wanted to be someone who saw beyond the surface, who treated people with dignity no matter where they came from or what they wore. She wanted to be someone who made a difference, even in small ways. As the day continued, Sophie noticed a change in herself. The way she interacted with the guests, the way she looked at people, everything felt different. She wasn't looking for validation through status anymore. She wasn't trying to impress anyone with her sharp judgments or keen observations. Instead, she was focusing on the human connection, on treating each guest with kindness and respect, regardless of what they had or didn't have. And slowly, as the days went by, she found that this new approach made her feel more fulfilled, more at peace. She no longer carried the burden of judging others, and that weightlessness brought a sense of freedom. By the end of the week, Sophie had become someone entirely different. She had found a new sense of purpose in her work, a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve others, not just in the capacity of a waitress, but as a fellow human being. And though she would never forget the lesson Keanu had taught her, she knew that the true test of her transformation was not in her words, but in her actions. She had learned that kindness, empathy, and respect were far more powerful than status or wealth. And she was determined to carry that lesson with her every day for the rest of her life. As the days passed, the ripple effects of that evening continued to reverberate in Sophie's life, transforming not only the way she approached her job, but also how she viewed the world around her. The humility Keanu had shown, the way he treated everyone with dignity despite their obvious judgments, lingered in her thoughts like a profound lesson. What had started as a moment of discomfort for Sophie became a turning point in her journey towards becoming a better person, both professionally and personally. The simple truth that kindness and respect mattered more than anything else now shaped every interaction she had. At work, Sophie noticed a shift. Her colleagues, who had witnessed the tension between her and Keanu, began to look at her differently. There were no more whispers behind her back. Instead, they observed her quiet transformation. Sophie no longer rushed through her shifts with the same sharp, competitive edge that she once had. She wasn't trying to climb the ladder by impressing the right people with her attitude or style. Instead, she was focused on creating a genuine connection with every guest who walked through the door. She saw them as human beings, not as labels or stereotypes to be judged by their appearance or perceived worth. This new mindset made her interactions more meaningful. She took the time to listen, to be present in every conversation, and to make each person feel valued. Her newfound humility didn't go unnoticed. In fact, it began to earn her respect. The guests who once might have been treated as invisible, the ones who didn't fit the typical mold of luxury diners, now felt seen and appreciated. Sophie's kindness was returned in kind, not in the form of extravagant tips or flashy compliments, but in the quiet gratitude of guests who felt valued. It wasn't the kind of recognition that came with a price tag, it was the kind of recognition that came from genuine human connection, a far more rewarding form of acknowledgement. Sophie's change also extended beyond her professional life. She found herself more mindful in her personal relationships as well. She stopped making assumptions about people based on their outward appearances. Instead, she listened more carefully, sought to understand more deeply, and made a conscious effort to treat everyone she encountered with the same respect she had learned to give her guests. She began to realize that every person has a story, a struggle, and a triumph, and none of those things were visible on the surface. By choosing to look beyond the exterior, Sophie discovered the richness of human experience and the profound connections that could be made when she took the time to appreciate people for who they truly were. In the weeks that followed, Sophie became a model of empathy and professionalism, earning praise not only from her colleagues but also from her manager, Richard. He recognized the change in her and pulled her aside one evening to thank her for her new approach. "You've become a role model for the rest of the team," he told her. "You've learned what it means to truly serve people, not just wait on them. Keep this up, Sophie. It's rare to find someone who cares so much about the human side of this business." Sophie smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey from arrogance to empathy had been difficult, but it had reshaped her in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Keanu's quiet lesson, delivered without judgment or words of condemnation, had set her on a path of personal growth she would never turn back from. The lesson from this story is clear: true respect and kindness are not defined by outward appearances, wealth, or status. It teaches us that judgment based on superficial qualities is both misguided and limiting. Keanu Reeves, despite being a world-renowned celebrity, demonstrated that humility and genuine respect for others transcend social expectations. Sophie, initially caught up in her own biases, learned that the way we treat people, regardless of who they are or what they have, matters far more than any external image. In today's world, where people are often judged by their possessions, social media presence, or status, this lesson is particularly relevant. In our fast-paced, image-driven society, it's easy to fall into the trap of making assumptions about others based on what we see on the surface. However, true connection and understanding come from looking beyond those surface-level factors. By treating people with kindness, empathy, and respect, regardless of their background or appearance, we can foster deeper, more meaningful relationships and create a more compassionate world. This story reminds us that the value of a person lies in their character and how they make others feel, not in what they own or how they look.